The last customer left just before midnight, and the flickering fluorescent lights of the small roadside convenience store hummed softly as Emily locked the glass door behind them. She was only 22, a college dropout trying to keep up with overdue rent and a mountain of hospital bills left behind by her mother's passing. The world outside was cold, a November night heavy with the kind of silence that makes small towns feel forgotten. Inside, Emily swept the floors with tired hands, the faint scent of cleaning solution mixing with the coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. The register drawer clinked as she counted the day's earnings. Not much, but it meant groceries for the week. Her shoulders ached and her eyes burned from exhaustion, yet beneath it all was a quiet pride. She was surviving. Behind the counter hung a small photo, her mother smiling beside a dusty old Harley. Emily's mother had been part of a local biker group once, the Iron Hearts. They weren't outlaws like people assumed. They were a family, the kind who rode to charity drives, rebuilt old bikes for veterans, and gathered around bonfires sharing stories about loyalty and second chances. Emily had grown up among them, small and barefoot, listening to their laughter echo across the fields. But after her mother's death, Emily had pulled away, believing she no longer belonged in that world. Tonight felt like any other, until she noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for almost an hour. At first, she ignored it. People often pulled over to make calls or rest, but when the headlights blinked twice and the car doors opened, her stomach tightened. 3 men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp and unfamiliar. They moved with a casual kind of arrogance, hands in their pockets, eyes fixed on the store's glowing sign. Emily's pulse quickened. She looked toward the back where the employee room door stood slightly ajar, the only exit besides the front. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself they'd just come for cigarettes or directions, but the store was closed. The closed sign hung clearly on the door, and yet one of them, tall, wearing a leather jacket with a torn sleeve, began tapping on the glass. The tapping grew louder, then a knock, then a fist. Emily froze. Her instincts screamed at her to hide, but she forced herself to stay still, pretending not to notice. She busied herself at the counter, pretending to count the register again, hoping they'd lose interest, but they didn't. The door handle rattled. The men laughed, and one of them called out, though Emily couldn't hear his words through the glass. His tone was enough. She glanced toward the back again and caught a flicker of movement, a shadow, broad, slow, silent. Someone was inside. For a heartbeat, fear spiked again, until the light hit a familiar patch sewn onto the back of a worn jacket. A skull framed by wings, the Iron Hearts. Emily's breath caught. 2 bikes had been parked in the alley earlier that evening. She remembered now, their engines rumbling like thunder. She hadn't realized their riders had stayed, and now in the dim store light she understood. She wasn't alone. The 3 men outside didn't know it yet. They thought the young cashier was an easy target. A girl working alone past midnight, trapped behind glass and silence. But inside the stockroom, 2 figures were already watching the door, watching the thugs, watching Emily. The night wasn't as quiet as it seemed. As the first thug kicked the glass with a sharp crack, Emily flinched, but the sound that followed wasn't from her. It was the low growl of boots on tile, and a deep voice she remembered from her childhood. And before the glass could shatter, the door to the back room opened. The next few moments would change everything. Emily didn't yet know that tonight. The world would remind her that not all heroes wear uniforms. Some still ride on 2 wheels. The faint creak of the back door felt like thunder in the tense silence. Emily turned, her heart hammering, as 2 figures stepped out from the dimly lit stockroom. Their presence filled the space, calm, deliberate, and solid like the ground before a storm. One was a tall man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and still carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had seen too many roads. His beard was streaked with gray, his leather jacket worn and faded, the Iron Hearts patch on the back dull from years of weather and wind. His name was Luke, though Emily hadn't seen him in years. Beside him stood Maya, younger but just as steady, her dark braid falling over the same patch on her back. She carried herself with the silent alertness of someone who never truly relaxed. the kind of woman who could read danger before it arrived. They both looked at Emily with eyes that recognized her immediately, even through the years. Luke's face softened for a brief second, almost tenderly, before he turned his gaze toward the front door, toward the shadows moving behind the glass. The men outside had grown impatient. One of them pounded harder, leaving smudges across the window. Another circled around toward the side alley, scanning for another way in. Emily stood frozen behind the counter, torn between fear and disbelief. She wanted to speak, to tell Luke she was fine, to say she didn't need help, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was watch. Luke didn't move toward the door yet. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind that steadies the storm within. Maya whispered something under her breath, not words, but the kind of sound that carried a warning. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the men exchanged looks. One of them, the one with the torn sleeve, sneered and pulled something from his jacket pocket. Emily's stomach sank. It wasn't a gun, but a metal crowbar, glinting faintly in the night. He raised it and slammed it against the door. The crack splintered across the glass like lightning. Emily jumped back. The next blow would break through. Luke moved then, not fast, but with a measured calm that came from a place beyond fear. He reached behind the counter and flipped off the lights. The store went dark. Only the glow from the refrigerator units painted streaks of blue across the walls. Emily's breath came quick and shallow. The silence felt endless. Then came the sound, a low, steady rumble. At first it was faint, like distant thunder, but it grew louder, closer, until even the glass began to tremble. From the alley behind the store, 2 motorcycles roared to life. The men outside froze. Confusion flashed across their faces as the engines revved, shaking the night. The second man, still near the side door, stumbled backward, scanning the shadows. The crowbar-wielding thug lowered his arm, eyes darting toward the sound. The confidence on his face began to crack. Inside, Emily pressed a hand to her chest, her heart slamming against her ribs. Luke didn't look at her, and he didn't need to. His focus stayed on the men outside. The growl of the bikes echoed through the walls, a sound Emily remembered from her childhood, the sound of her mother's people, the sound of home. The thugs began to retreat, muttering, trying to make sense of what they'd walked into. But before they could get to their car, the alley filled with more light, more engines. 2 more bikes turned the corner, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The riders didn't rush. They just stopped, idling, watching, silent, waiting. There was a kind of reverence in the air now, a shift so subtle that even Emily could feel it. The men who had come to intimidate a lone cashier suddenly looked small against the shadow of something much older, much stronger, the brotherhood of people who didn't abandon their own. Inside, Luke stepped forward, unlocking the door but keeping it shut. He didn't open it, he didn't need to. The message was already clear. The man with the crowbar hesitated, his breath fogging in the cold. His companions were already backing toward the car, whispering frantically. He looked around, realizing that they were surrounded, not by police, but by something far more unpredictable. Emily stood behind the counter, barely breathing, as the thugs finally stumbled back into their car. The engine sputtered once, then roared, tires screeching as they sped into the darkness. The sound faded until there was only silence again. The heavy, almost sacred kind that follows chaos. Luke exhaled slowly. The tension in his shoulders eased and Maya flicked the lights back on. For the first time that night, Emily could see his face clearly. Lines of age, fatigue, and quiet sadness etched across it. But behind his eyes there was something else. Pride. Recognition. She realized then that they hadn't just happened to be there. They had stayed behind for her. They had known she was alone. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. For years she'd avoided them. The club, the memories, the pain. But tonight the Iron Hearts had returned when she needed them most. Luke turned to her, his eyes soft now. Though he said nothing, Emily understood. Family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was leather and dust and people who never forgot where you came from. She wanted to thank him, to say something, anything. But before she could, the sound of another engine approached. Slower this time. Deeper. And the way Luke's face changed, A flicker of something like awe told her this was someone unexpected, someone important. Emily turned toward the sound as it drew closer, tires crunching over gravel, a single headlight glowing like an ember in the night. Whoever it was, they hadn't seen each other in a very long time. The air outside the store had changed. The danger was gone, but the tension hadn't lifted. It lingered thick and unspoken as the lone motorcycle approached. Its engine's growl was lower, steadier, almost haunting. Emily stood frozen near the counter, her hands still trembling from what had just happened. The clock above her hummed faintly, ticking toward 1 in the morning. Beyond the glass, the other bikers waited in silence, their headlights glowing like watchful eyes in the cold night. Luke stepped closer to the window, his expression unreadable. Maya's eyes followed the approaching light too, her posture straight as though preparing for something she couldn't quite name. Then the engine cut. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Out of the darkness, the figure appeared, dismounting slowly, helmet in hand, long coat brushing against worn boots. The faint light from the store caught on the streaks of silver in his hair. Emily's breath caught. She knew that face. Or rather, she remembered its outline. The eyes that once looked down at her with warmth, the faint scar on his cheek, the heavy presence that once filled her childhood with both awe and fear. It was her mother's closest friend, Jack Monroe. The man who had ridden beside her mother for over a decade, the one who had carried her coffin when no one else could, but he had disappeared afterward. No one had heard from him since, until now. Luke opened the door quietly, letting the cold wind sweep in. Jack stepped inside, the faint scent of road dust and gasoline trailing behind him, a scent that instantly pulled Emily years backward. To nights when her mother's laughter echoed through garage walls, to the rhythmic sounds of engines and the glow of bonfires against the desert sky. Jack's eyes found Emily almost immediately. He stopped, frozen in the same disbelief that mirrored hers. The years had changed them both, but something familiar, something deeply human, flickered between them. Emily's throat tightened. She hadn't realized until this moment how much she still missed that world, and how deeply she had buried it under grief. Luke said nothing. He simply watched as Jack took a slow step forward, removing his gloves and setting them gently on the counter. His hands were calloused, weathered by miles of asphalt and storms, but when they trembled slightly, it wasn't from cold. The silence was unbearable. Jack looked around the small store, the flickering lights, the faint hum of the coolers, the broken glass on the floor from where the thugs had struck, and then his gaze settled again on Emily. There was pain in his eyes, but also something deeper, regret. He didn't need to speak for Emily to understand. She had been angry with him once. After her mother's death, he had promised to stay on to look after her, but instead he'd vanished. She'd spent years trying to hate him for it, but seeing him now, older, weary, and still loyal enough to ride through the night for her, something inside her softened. Luke finally broke the silence, his voice low and heavy. "You picked a good night to come back," he said almost to himself. Jack's gaze shifted toward the shattered glass door. "Heard some noise on the road," he murmured. "Didn't think it'd lead me here." The others outside hadn't left. Their bikes idled quietly, the riders keeping their distance, giving space to what they knew was no ordinary reunion. Emily turned away briefly, trying to compose herself. She swept up the fragments of broken glass from the floor, but her hands shook too much to finish. Luke moved to help, but Jack gently placed a hand on her shoulder first. That small touch, careful, almost reverent, was enough to undo her. For years, she'd carried the weight of being alone. For years, she'd convinced herself she didn't need anyone. But tonight, surrounded by these people, the ones her mother once called family, Emily felt something crack open in her chest. Something she thought was gone forever. It wasn't safety she felt. It was belonging. Jack walked toward the back of the store, glancing at the photo still hanging above the counter. Emily's mother smiling beside that same Harley. He reached up and touched the edge of the frame, tracing it with a trembling thumb. "Still watching us, huh?" he whispered under his breath. Emily swallowed hard, her vision blurring. The moment felt endless, a quiet acknowledgement of everything lost and everything still left. Outside, the sound of the bikes shifted. One by one, their engines cut off, leaving only the cold wind sweeping across the empty street. The world felt small again and the night seemed to exhale. Luke checked his watch, then turned toward Emily. "We'll stay till sunrise," he said gently. "No one's coming near this place again tonight." Emily nodded, unable to speak. Maya began pulling chairs together near the counter, setting up a quiet guard station as if it were second nature. Luke sat by the window, eyes scanning the street. And Jack. Jack remained standing, hands in his pockets, his gaze lost somewhere between past and present. Emily sat on the floor beside the counter, leaning her head against the wall. The adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by the quiet ache of exhaustion. But even through the haze of fear and fatigue, she couldn't help but think, maybe this night hadn't happened to her. Maybe it had happened for her. Because sometimes it takes danger to bring the people who matter back into your life. As her eyes drifted shut, the faint rumble of a distant storm echoed beyond the hills. But it wasn't thunder that woke her an hour later. It was voices, harsh, unfamiliar and somewhere outside. The night wasn't over yet. Emily woke to the sound of footsteps. Faint, deliberate, too light to be Luke's heavy boots or Jack's careful stride. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, the echo of danger bleeding into her sleep. But when she opened her eyes, she saw it, a flicker of movement in the parking lot beyond the window. The faint pre-dawn light was beginning to creep over the horizon, painting the asphalt in shades of gray and blue. The store was quiet. Luke sat in the same chair near the window, his head tilted slightly forward, eyes half shut but never truly asleep. Maya leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Jack stood near the door, silent, alert, a man who'd learned long ago that peace never lasts long. Then came the low hum, an engine idling somewhere down the street. Not a bike this time. A car. Luke lifted his head, eyes narrowing. "They're back," he muttered. Emily's stomach dropped. The same black sedan from before sat at the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine purring like a predator waiting to strike. But this time, they weren't alone. A second vehicle pulled up beside it, a rust-colored pickup with tinted windows, the kind that didn't belong to anyone passing through town. Emily stepped back, instinctively moving closer to Jack. The fear she thought she'd buried came flooding back. The shattered glass from earlier had been cleaned up, but its memory still glittered beneath her shoes. Maya's hand went to her jacket pocket. Luke stood slowly, stretching his shoulders like a man preparing for an old, familiar ritual. He didn't look afraid, just tired of men who thought fear was a weapon. Outside, the car doors opened. 5 men this time. The ones from before, and 2 new faces. They moved with the kind of cocky aggression that came from realizing they'd been embarrassed earlier. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about pride. Emily felt her throat tighten. "They came back because of me," she whispered. Jack's voice was low but steady. "No, they came back because they don't know when to quit." The wind picked up, rattling the store sign. The sound of leather jackets shifting, boots scraping pavement. It was the sound of confrontation breathing to life. Luke turned to Maya. "Wake the others." Maya nodded and slipped out the back door quietly. Within moments, the faint thrum of engines returned. Not loud, not yet. Just enough to say, "We're still here." Inside the store, Emily stood trembling behind the counter. Jack moved beside her, his hand resting gently on the counter's edge. His expression was calm, but his eyes, though steady, haunted eyes and watched every shadow. The men outside spread out, one kicking at a trash bin, another tapping the glass with his knuckles like before. This time, the sound didn't scare Emily. It angered her. Luke opened the door before they could knock again. He didn't step out, he didn't need to. His presence filled the doorway, every inch of him radiating unspoken authority. "Store's closed," he said quietly. The leader, the one with the torn jacket, smirked. "Looks like it's open enough for company." His voice dripped with arrogance. Jack stepped forward, his body angled between Emily and the men. "You boys should leave," he said simply. The leader laughed, taking a step closer. "Or what, you'll call the cops?" Jack's silence was answer enough. The faint rumble from the alley grew louder. 4 motorcycles this time. Their headlights appeared behind the cars like ghosts cutting through the gray dawn. The thugs turned, startled, their confidence faltering as the sound built, rolling across the street like thunder. The leader took a step back. He hadn't expected resistance, not like this. Luke didn't move. "You picked the wrong store," he said. "And the wrong girl." The men hesitated, glancing at one another, realizing they were surrounded. What had been a show of power was quickly unraveling into something else: humiliation. The kind that follows a man home and eats at his pride forever. The leader spat on the ground. "You think you scare us?" he muttered. Jack's eyes hardened. "No," he said softly. "But she should." He turned slightly, nodding toward Emily. And in that moment, standing there in the pale light of dawn, her fear still trembling beneath her skin, she understood. She wasn't helpless. Not anymore. The woman she had become, the one who had survived loss, loneliness, and endless nights behind a cash register, stood taller now. Her mother's spirit lived in her bones. The leader sneered again, but it was weaker this time. He looked at the bikes, then back at Jack, and something in his posture broke. One of the other men muttered something under his breath, a plea to leave before things got worse. They turned. One by one, they climbed back into their cars, engines growling, tires spitting gravel as they drove off without looking back. The sound faded down the empty road until it was gone, swallowed by the rising sun. Luke exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. Maya reappeared from the alley, nodding once to signal that the others were gone. Silence filled the space again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of fear, it was relief, strength, closure. Jack turned toward Emily, his eyes soft now. For the first time since he arrived, he smiled, faintly, sadly. "She'd be proud of you," he said. Emily's breath hitched. He didn't have to say who. She knew. Outside, the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, golden and forgiving. The Ironheart's bikes glimmered faintly in its glow, the dust on their chrome catching the light like sparks from a fire long kept alive. Inside, Emily looked around the store, at the mess, the broken sign, the faint scent of burned rubber in the air, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, protected, remembered. But somewhere deep inside, she also felt something else, the stir of a decision she hadn't yet made, because maybe this night wasn't just a rescue. Maybe it was a calling. And as the sun climbed higher, painting the town in gold, Emily realized the story wasn't over. The Ironhearts had returned, and perhaps, so would she. The sun had fully risen by the time the last of the Ironhearts rode away from the parking lot. Their engines faded into the hum of the waking town, leaving behind the faint smell of gasoline and warm asphalt. Emily stood in the doorway of the small convenience store, her arms folded tightly across her chest, watching them disappear into the horizon. For a long time, she didn't move. The morning light wrapped around her like something unfamiliar, too bright after a night that had felt endless. Luke lingered by his bike, speaking quietly with Maya. They were both tired but calm, like soldiers who'd weathered one more fight in a long war they no longer feared. Jack, however, remained beside the window, staring at the cracked glass where the thugs had struck hours ago. He hadn't said much since the sun came up. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that hadn't been said in years. Emily walked over, brushing her palms against her apron. "You should get some rest," she murmured. Jack didn't look at her. His reflection stared back from the glass, older, heavier, weighed down by miles of guilt. "Can't rest," he said quietly. "Not when I'm back here." Emily tilted her head. "You mean the town?" He shook his head slowly. "I mean, this place. Her world, yours." The words hung in the air like dust motes, glowing in the slant of morning light. Emily's eyes drifted to the photo on the counter, her mother smiling with her arms wrapped around Jack and Luke, the three of them radiant with laughter and grease-stained joy. That photo had lived there for years, but this was the first time she truly looked at it. She could almost hear her mother's voice, warm and teasing, saying, "Home isn't where you live, Emmy. It's the people who'd ride through hell to reach you." Emily swallowed the ache in her throat. When her mother died, Emily had wanted nothing to do with that world. The noise, the danger, the endless talk of loyalty and roads and engines. She thought it was all bravado. a distraction from pain. So she ran, far enough to convince herself she could build something safer. But safety had come with loneliness. And now, looking at the remnants of last night, the shattered glass, the bruised pride, and the steady devotion of people who hadn't forgotten her, she wondered if running away had really protected her from anything at all. Luke came up behind them, his voice low. "We'll fix that door before we leave, and maybe add a camera out back." Emily nodded, grateful but quiet. "You did good last night," he said softly. "You kept your head. Your mom would have been proud." That word again, proud. It hit differently this time. Jack finally turned from the window, his eyes softening. "You remind me of her," he said. "The same stubborn fire. The same way of pretending you don't need anyone until the world proves you wrong." Emily tried to smile, but her lip trembled. "I used to think needing people made me weak," she said. Jack's gaze held hers. "No, it just makes you human." The simplicity of his words cut deeper than she expected. Outside, the street was waking up. A mail truck passed, a jogger waved. Life moved on, unaware of the quiet storm that had passed through during the night. Maya came in holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "We're heading back to the garage after this," she said. "The guys want to see you, Emily. It's been too long." Emily hesitated. The garage, her mother's old world. The sound of tools, laughter, and the radio always humming in the background. It felt like a lifetime ago, another universe entirely. Jack watched her closely. "You don't have to decide now," he said gently. "But you should know. You never stopped being one of us." Emily looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't quite worn off. For years she'd believed she didn't belong anywhere. Not in college, not in the city, not even in her own skin. But maybe belonging wasn't something you earned. Maybe it was something that never left you, no matter how far you tried to run. The sun climbed higher, the golden light spilling across the floor. Luke finished patching the window and Maya cleaned up the last of the mess. The store looked normal again, ordinary even. But Emily knew nothing about this morning was ordinary. When the Iron Hearts finally mounted their bikes, Luke paused at the door. "If you change your mind," he said, "you know where to find us." Jack didn't say anything. He just looked at her one last time, as if trying to read her decision before she'd made it. Then he slid on his gloves, turned the key, and the roar of his bike filled the street once more. Emily stood at the window watching until they disappeared around the corner. The air felt quieter without them, too quiet. She turned back to the store, the place she'd spent so many lonely nights, and for the first time, she saw it for what it was. A cage she'd built to keep the world out. Her mother's old photo caught the morning light again, and Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start living. She picked up her jacket, locked the door, and stepped outside. The sound of the road called to her, soft, steady, alive. In the distance, she could almost hear the fading echo of engines. And in her heart, she knew exactly where they led.